From political brinkmanship to the real risk of conflict, the truth behind the rhetoric. In a world already on edge, an American president stands at the brink, not on distant battlefields, but just miles from the southern shores of the Americas. He says the strike could come very soon, but what he really means may be even more dangerous. To understand why the words "the strike could come soon" echo so loudly, it is necessary to look beyond today's headlines and trace the long, uneasy relationship between the United States and Venezuela, a relationship shaped by ideology, oil, and power. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was a strategic partner of Washington, supplying energy to the American economy and sitting firmly within the United States' sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. That balance shifted dramatically in 1999 with the rise of Hugo Chavez, whose socialist revolution openly challenged U.S. dominance, nationalized industries, expelled American influence, and aligned Venezuela with U.S. adversaries such as Russia, China, and Iran. After Chavez's death, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherited not only power, but a country spiraling into economic collapse, marked by hyperinflation, shortages, mass migration, and political unrest, all of which transformed Venezuela into a powerful symbol inside U.S. domestic politics. A cautionary tale frequently invoked in American debates about socialism and governance. When Donald Trump entered office in 2017, Venezuela became central to his administration's maximum pressure strategy, which relied on sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and open support for opposition figures in an effort to force regime change, an effort that culminated in 2019 when Washington backed Juan Guaidó as interim president, only to watch Maduro remain firmly in control. That failure lingered politically, and when Trump returned to the presidency, Venezuela reemerged not merely as a diplomatic problem, but as unfinished business in a world already strained by conflict and rivalry. This time, the rhetoric hardened as the administration reframed Venezuela as a direct national security threat, accusing the Maduro government of enabling drug trafficking, harboring criminal networks, and serving as a foothold for hostile foreign powers. Language that carries legal and political weight inside the United States because it allows military force to be justified under counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism authorities. As U.S. naval and air assets increased their presence in the Caribbean under the banner of routine operations, President Trump repeatedly stated that military action against Venezuela could happen very soon, a phrase he returned to again and again over months, intentionally blurring the line between warning and preparation. Inside Washington, lawmakers questioned whether the president possessed the authority to act without Congress, while legal scholars warned that rhetoric alone could trigger real-world consequences. And abroad, allies and adversaries alike watched closely, aware that in American foreign policy, ambiguity can be a weapon, one that rallies domestic support, unsettles opponents, and shifts attention from internal political struggles to external threats. By the time Trump's warnings became a fixture of the news cycle, the crisis was no longer just about Venezuela itself, but about the broader question of how U.S. power is wielded, how domestic politics shape decisions of war and peace, and how easily the distance between political language and military action can collapse into a single, irreversible moment. From counter-narcotics to conflict, the U.S. administration claimed a new strategy: treat Venezuelan drug networks as foreign terrorist organizations. On this basis, U.S. forces struck boats at sea, killing dozens, and deployed the largest force in the Caribbean in decades. Political theater at home. But while Trump vowed imminent action, Congress pushed back, debating war powers, legal authority, and the cost of unapproved military operations. Outside the Capitol, the argument wasn't just political, it was constitutional. Venezuela's response. In Caracas, President Maduro called it imperialism. The Venezuelan armed forces vowed to defend the nation. Militia mobilizations and rhetorical brinkmanship turned fear into resolve. International pressure and diplomacy. Across the hemisphere, leaders called for peace. The UN urged restraint. Mexico offered to mediate. Russia warned Washington against a fatal mistake. Even without a formal declaration of war or a full-scale invasion, The prolonged threat of a U.S. strike against Venezuela has already produced lasting consequences that extend far beyond the possibility of missiles or airstrikes. Inside the United States, President Trump's repeated claims that action could come soon normalized a state of permanent military anticipation, where rhetoric itself became a tool of power, shifting foreign policy authority further toward the executive branch and away from Congress. Lawmakers debated war powers and legality, while military deployments, naval patrols, and enforcement actions continued under broad counter-narcotics and national security justifications, reinforcing a dangerous precedent in which sustained pressure and lethal force can occur without clear authorization or defined objectives. Politically, the crisis also served a domestic purpose, reinforcing an image of strength and decisiveness, while turning Venezuela into a symbol within America's internal ideological battles. Less a sovereign nation than a warning used in debates over power, governance, and national identity. Beyond Washington, the impact rippled across Latin America, where governments watched with unease, recalling a long history of U.S. intervention in the region and fearing that unilateral action could destabilize an already fragile hemisphere. Economically, the threat of conflict intensified Venezuela's isolation, further constraining oil exports and deepening humanitarian suffering. While global energy markets reacted nervously to the possibility of disruption in the Caribbean at a time of worldwide instability, for ordinary Venezuelans, the aftermath was defined not by open warfare, but by uncertainty, the constant awareness that military action could arrive without warning, reinforcing a siege mentality that strengthened the government's narrative of resistance even as it exhausted civilian resilience. Internationally, the crisis exposed the limits of diplomacy as calls for restraint from the United Nations and regional leaders struggled to influence events, highlighting how great power pressure can override multilateral norms. Strategically, the standoff normalized an expanded U.S. military presence near Venezuela's borders, increasing the risk of miscalculation and drawing warnings from rival powers that escalation in one region could spill into wider global tensions. Ultimately, the most profound impact of the Venezuela crisis lies not in what happened, but in what it revealed. That modern conflict often begins long before the first shot is fired, through language, ambiguity, and sustained pressure that quietly reshape laws, expectations, and lives. By the time the threat of a strike became routine, the United States was already engaged in a new kind of confrontation, one where the boundary between peace and war blurred, and where the legacy would be measured not only in policy outcomes, but in how easily the idea of force became normalized as an instrument of politics. What started as political rhetoric has become a defining moment, not just for U.S. foreign policy, but for the fragile balance between peace and conflict. This is a story of power, of politics, and of the human costs that come when nations stand on the brink. In the end, the story of Trump's repeated vow to strike Venezuela soon is not simply a story about one country, one president, or one moment in history, but about the evolving nature of power in the modern world and the fragile space that exists between words and war. What began as rhetoric, statements delivered at podiums, posted online, and echoed through news cycles, gradually transformed into something heavier, something more consequential, reminding us that in international politics, language is never neutral. Each warning, each promise of imminent action, reshaped expectations, conditioned public opinion, and narrowed the space for diplomacy until the threat itself became a form of pressure as real as ships at sea or aircraft in the sky. For the United States, the Venezuela crisis exposed enduring tensions at the heart of its democracy. Between executive authority and congressional oversight, between the desire for decisive action and the constitutional limits designed to prevent reckless conflict. For Venezuela, it reinforced a long-standing narrative of siege and resistance, one that empowered the state even as it deepened the suffering of ordinary people caught between internal crisis and external pressure. And for the wider world, it served as a warning that in an era of constant connectivity and instant escalation, wars no longer begin with declarations or invasions, but with ambiguity, repetition, and normalization, when the idea of force becomes familiar, expected, and politically useful. The question that lingers is not whether a strike ultimately happens, but what is lost along the way when threats become routine and restraint is treated as weakness. History shows that once the threshold between peace and conflict is blurred, it becomes easier to cross and harder to return. The Venezuela episode reminds us that power exercised without clarity invites miscalculation, that pressure without purpose can entrench the very outcomes it seeks to undo, and that the true cost of brinkmanship is often paid not by leaders, but by societies living under its shadow. As the headlines fade and the word soon disappears from political speeches, the legacy of this moment remains, a quiet shift in how force is discussed, justified, and accepted. It leaves us with a final, unsettling reflection that the most dangerous conflicts are not always the ones that explode suddenly, but the ones that unfold slowly, through words repeated until they feel inevitable, and through choices made in the space where caution gives way to confidence and confidence to consequence.